Hannes, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Should I share my screen?
Yes, go ahead. This is your session. I'm going to sit back and listen in.
Is that working? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. This is the first time that I'm speaking at the Journalism AI Festival. And I'm really happy that I can talk about one of my passions, namely guidelines for AI in news. Like Chepo said, my name is Hannes Kools. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm actually working at the AI Media and Democracy Lab. And at that lab, we're roughly 10 researchers. So it's a combination of PhDs and postdocs. And we work interdisciplinary on, well, the potential impact of AI in newsrooms. So we work with different media partners. Actually, right now I am in London because I'm doing a project with BBC, but we're also doing other projects with other news outlets, for example, also in the Netherlands. So this guidelines workshop also comes out of this sort of work that I've been doing over the last couple of months. And of course, I want to give you a little introduction of what I'll be talking about today. So first of all, I'm going to be talking just about guidelines. This is based on an analysis that I've done together with Nick Diakopoulos, who will be speaking actually in the next session, where we looked at already existing guidelines, looking at similarities, but also somehow blind spots in these guideline documents that we could find. Then also a little bit guidelines for guidelines, in the sense that what we've seen so far over the last months is that we have been following different news organizations also throughout that process of crafting these different guidelines. And based on that sort of experience, I'll be talking about, well, different approaches that some news organizations have, but also maybe some recommendations that we've seen, or some lessons learned that we've seen from following these different news organizations. The third part will be about, are guardrails enough? Because of course we have seen that there are these guideline documents in place, but I'll give you a little anecdote from something that happened at a specific news outlet and how that was being dealt with in relation to guidelines. And then the last part is a conclusion. So 3 concluding thoughts and some next steps, because we're also working on some follow-up research. And I mean, I can't really look around the room, but I can imagine that some people within specific news organizations are working on guidelines or are thinking about working on guidelines. And we would like to hear from you as well. But that's for the end of this presentation. So first things first, of course, these guideline documents, I mean, there were already guideline documents even before ChatGPT was unleashed onto the world, so to say. But of course, for this specific presentation, we focused on guidelines that were, well, published over the last couple of months, specifically also addressing generative AI. But of course, some of these guidelines can also be extrapolated to the broader use of AI, so to say. So this analysis that we have done is also based on, well, what kind of news organizations we already had contact with. So of course, here I visualized the guidelines that we had. I think if I remember correctly, we had 14, well, we had 21 guidelines in total, but 14 guidelines from Europe. Then we had some guidelines from the USA, one from Canada, then one from Brazil, and one from Hong Kong. So in total, like I said, we had 21 guidelines, mostly from Europe. And of course, we did this analysis in June, so a couple of months ago. If we would do this kind of analysis again, of course, we would have some more guidelines to include in our analysis. But this is just an important disclaimer as well, because I'm going to be talking about similarities and blind spots and these kind of things. But they, of course, only count for these 21 guidelines, or the ones that we included in this analysis. So some of the similarities, some of the things that we have seen when we did the analysis is actually when you look at the broader structure of these guideline documents, you see that most of these documents actually start with some sort of definitions of what is artificial intelligence, what is generative AI, what are LLMs, these kind of things. And then they dive deeper into the specific elements of the guidelines. And one of the most prominent ones was actually the human in the loop principle, or human oversight, so to say. So a lot of news organizations really strengthen or emphasize that there will always be a human at the end of the process, and that is, of course, put into different wordings. I'll show some examples in a minute. Another one is transparency. So, of course, these guideline documents, they say when we will be using generative AI, they of course want to label it as such. So news organizations say, well, if we use generative AI, we should label it, or we should at least explain also why we have used this these tools. Now, transparency is a very interesting one, and this is maybe a little sidetrack. I've also done interviews with journalists both in Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark. And there is no such thing as a consensus on transparency right now in these guidelines, because some people say, well, we also use, for example, translation software and these kind of things. Maybe sometimes it's not beneficial to be transparent towards the end user or towards the audience, because they might be not inclined to pay for their subscription or these kind of things. So transparency is, in that regard, a very interesting one, because a lot of these guideline documents explicitly say, well, we will be transparent in all cases. But then when I talk to, well, journalists, but also more newsroom managers and these kind of people, they say, well, maybe sometimes we shouldn't say that generative AI was being used. Another one that was very prominent in these documents was allowed versus banned uses of these technologies. So of course, some are very specific. Some say, well, we will only use it for headlines, we will only use it for grammar, these kind of things. Whereas others are more restrictive even and say, well, we won't use it at all. So it's more like these conservative guidelines, but having that in the guidelines nonetheless. A fourth aspect is responsible experimentation. So some explicitly state in their guidelines. So for example, Mediahuis, which is a prominent, well, Dutch-Belgian news outlet, they say, well, we will have a specific team experiment with these tools before we start like a broader implementation of these generative AI tools. And then the last aspect that came up, well, a lot or quite a lot, is also the possibility to adapt these guidelines. And of course, as well, many of you know, these technologies change. So a lot of news organizations actually explicitly state, well, these documents can change at any time. For example, when we did the analysis back in June, it was funny, we already put all the documents in one folder. And then we went back and checked on websites if there were already some changes. And I remember from Wired that there were already some changes in these guideline documents. And that was just a matter of weeks. So that's also one of the things that we will be looking into, or that's a potential pathway to look deeper into, well, these guidelines in the future or in future research. So one that I find very interesting, or that I saw in one guideline document, is of course human oversight. Like I said, it's one of the most prominent ones that was being mentioned. This is from the Dutch press office. A and B, and they say in our production chain, we stick to the already established line, human, machine, human, where thinking and decision-making begins and ends with humans. And I like this three-part way of looking at human oversight, that the machine can be in between and do maybe some sort of processes behind the scenes, but that the human is still, the end, the one who's responsible at the end of the production chain. Transparency. Here you say, you see wired. So we will be clear with audiences and staff about where we use AI and what data we collect. We'll make sure they can understand why we use it, how it works, and how it affects them. So this is, of course, again, like I said, the transparency, like very explicitly saying, well, when we use it, it's not only that we just label it, but also understand why we use it, how it works, and how it affects them. But that will also, I'll come back to that, how then, of course, you can have these principles, but how do you translate that into, well, real practice? Less mentioned, and again, I should say as a disclaimer, of course, we analyzed 21 guidelines. I must say, after we have published our research, we published it on Medium, we got a lot of contact from news organizations, and we have been involved in that process. And I should say that some of these, well, less mentioned ones are now already more prominent in some of the documents. So the first one, for example, bias, was not super or was less mentioned in these guideline documents. But of course, from the perspective of, well, us as researchers, we think it's very important to include bias also in guidelines. We've seen that some of these guideline documents are very short, others are just more lengthy, 3 to 5 to 6 pages sometimes, but that depends again on the news organization. So sometimes bias is not necessarily addressed in these shorter documents we've seen. Then privacy, of course, is a very important one. If you copy paste certain things in ChatGPT and these kind of tools, then that can, of course, be used again to train the model and these kind of things. I know that there is some sort of opt-out button with ChatGPT, but still you need to be very careful with that. And I've also given specific trainings on the uses of generative AI in newsrooms. And my impression is that, well, some journalists don't know that. So I was giving a training to investigative journalists, and I said, well, privacy, that's a big issue. And someone said, well, yeah, there was an investigative journalist. I copy pasted addresses and telephone numbers because I wanted to generate a nice, beautiful table. So yeah, I think that is also still maybe a blind spot. So it's not even, it's important that it is mentioned in guidelines, but I think it also has to do with literacy of these technologies. Then sustainability is also not mentioned. I think it was only mentioned once or twice in these guidelines. Maybe you can also wonder that this is not necessarily something that you should put into guidelines, but some news organizations have sort of values, sustainability, these kind of things. So maybe in line with already existing values, it could be interesting to have that in there. And of course, I think we've barely scratched the surface of, well, what the potential climate repercussions will be of large language models. But we've also seen that from recent research that it is taking up a lot of energy because, of course, you need server capacity, you need water to cool down servers, these kind of things. So that's also something that is missing quite a lot. Training is also not mentioned a lot. So, I mean, Mediahuis, to come back to Mediahuis, they have a section where they say, well, we will deliberately train all of our journalists before they can start interacting with generative AI tools. So they make that very explicit also in the guidelines. And then the last one is also feedback from the audience. We haven't really seen that a lot. I think only in one guideline document where there was at the end an email address of a news organization well, an actual person where people could send their questions to. And I must say that this is also a very good way of, when people would have questions about specific uses of generative AI or generative AI tools, that is like a nice service as well. So these were some of the well, less mentioned ones. Again, some excerpts. So we have here bias. This is from The Guardian. We will guard against the dangers of bias embedded within generative tools and their underlying training sets. Of course, how you will guard against these dangers is still unclear. So sometimes these guidelines are, in that sense, still vague, but it is mentioned nonetheless. Privacy, like I said, the Dutch public broadcaster, we protect the privacy of our resources. Confidential information is not shared with AI tools like ChatGPT. So this is also very explicit in these guidelines. And then user feedback. We encourage readers to give feedback and let them review their data. So this is from a Brazilian news outlet where they talk specifically about the user, which I think is also quite important when you're talking about guidelines, because of course, mostly these like outward facing guideline documents are meant for your audience or for your subscribers even. So this is the part about the similarities and the less mentioned, or maybe sometimes blind spots. Maybe you're thinking even of other blind spots that are not, well, in the guidelines right now. But this is what we've seen from the analysis. A little bit guidelines for guidelines, because of course, as you know, these things have been gone quite quickly. So these guideline documents have been published over the last couple of months. So we also tried to grasp how these guideline documents were being formed and these kind of things. So for example, in the Netherlands, there was already a document that was being shared with other, well, competing news outlets, and some of these organizations have also used that one document to start from. So I think also in that regard, some of these guideline documents, it's not always necessary to reinvent the wheel there. And then I'll also give you some recommendations. So different approaches. So we've seen that sometimes there is this more top-down versus bottom-up approach. What do I mean by that? Of course, top-down is that there is already this guideline document. So in this one news organization in the Netherlands, there was already this document, and it was just being shared via email. And this was, well, there wasn't really a lot of involvement in or broader involvement with the broader news organization. Whereas with the bottom-up approach, there is some sort of working group coming together with different people in there that are talking about this, that are sometimes also experimenting with different LLMs, these kind of things, in order to draft, well, adequate or proportional guidelines. AI task forces, this is also something that I've seen in my interview studies, that in some news organizations where they have resources, and now I say AI task forces, but sometimes it's also just AI task force, one person who is, well, in charge of coming up with guidelines and these kind of things. But sometimes in, for example, newsrooms in Denmark, I know that they have like a proper working group. They call themselves also the AI task force, that are working on these guidelines, and sometimes then people from legal are also involved in that. Yeah, I mean, there is still some disparity, like I already said. So sometimes it's more like conservative, very restrictive guidelines saying, well, we won't be using it at all. And then maybe they leave some ample room for that they will use it later for experimentation. Whereas you have also the more liberal guidelines where there is really some ample room for adjustments and edits, where they say explicitly that they will use it for specific uses, specific implementations. So there is also still some disparity there, and also from talking to news organizations that were working on these guidelines, some said that they were more reassured when they had more conservative guidelines in place, because they were also quite unsure how the technology would evolve. So some were more in favor of the fact that they could, well, still be very restrictive and then maybe open up when, I don't know, the dust was settled a bit more, because of course ChatGPT was also, and other LLMs are just updated continuously. And then also, and this is something that we will look into also in future research, is, well, the difference between external and internal guidelines within one organization, or within even one news organization. So for example, a Dutch public broadcaster who we got into close contact with, they have an external version, very short version of their guidelines. It's, I think, five statements. That's it. And then they have an internal guideline document, which is way more specific. I think it's 5 or 6 pages, where they give more specific examples. So this could also be when you are working on guidelines or thinking of writing guidelines, that is maybe a very valuable way of doing it. Also in terms of translating these, well, principles to practices, and specifically for the Dutch public broadcaster, they also say that they are experimenting with it and that they will update the guidelines along the way. So a little bit, yeah, top down. It's of course more from coming from the management, and then that feeds into the larger news organization. Now, of course, with bigger news organizations, I've also seen that some people are not even aware that there are guidelines. So that is, I think, also a potential problem, that sometimes when, well, even when it is top down or when it is bottom up, that the visibility of these guidelines, these rules, these guardrails, well, are not always that visible. And then the bottom up, so you have a working group. That can be people that are higher up in the organization, but it can also be people that are, well, working as a journalist or legal people. This working group is, well, drafting these guidelines, sometimes also asks for feedback from the broader organization. And then sometimes there's also some experimentation involved. And then, of course, sometimes you see that the larger, or the management, the upper management, still wants to give some feedback. So specifically for one organization that we talked to as well, there was this working group. They were working on these guidelines. They looked at already existing guideline documents. They drafted it, or they translated it more towards their own, well, norms and values that they already had from their organization. And then they went to the larger, or the executive level, so to say, and talked about these guidelines, and then they were still adjusted by the upper management. So these, of course, is a very maybe binary way of illustrating how these guidelines are being drafted. But of course, if you have the resources to have maybe working group or these kind of things, then that can also help to have like this kind of practicality, or this principle to practices translation in your organization. Of course, there is this question of, are guardrails enough, right? So of course, we've seen over the last couple of months, it was almost like marketing, look at us. We also have guidelines that were being published on their website, and these kind of things. So a lot of news organizations were busy working on these guidelines. And I think that also makes me hopeful that it is being taken very seriously, also in line with already existing values from an organization. So these documents really prove as well that, well, that people are serious about the fact that we need to think about how to put in place these guardrails in order to also have this kind of responsible AI approach that a lot of people are talking about right now. So I want to share a little anecdote. So I know for a fact that there was a journalist from a legacy newspaper that I won't name right now, and that journalist used ChatGPT for an in memoriam. So someone died and someone prominent died, and that journalist used ChatGPT to help him write that article. Now, that article was being published in the physical newspaper, of course, the day after. And people who knew that person of that in memoriam, they contacted the newspaper because they said, well, there were various factual errors in that article. Now, of course, that journalist was not transparent towards his editor that he used ChatGPT. And of course, yeah, that journalist was not transparent, but then they still needed to decide to publish some sort of correction the next day to say that there were, well, I think there were 5 factual errors in that specific article. So the journalist didn't say that he used ChatGPT, and then of course the newspaper didn't mention in the correction in the physical newspaper the day after that these factual errors were caused by ChatGPT. Of course, well, the journalist was still responsible, but this also shows sometimes that, well, this is not being shared with the audience. So there was no mention of generative AI whatsoever. Now, this organization already had guidelines in place and also said, well, transparency, we will be transparent when we use it, these kind of things. So my point for this section is also that it's good to have these guidelines in place, but the next step, and this is also something that we've seen right now, is translating these principles. So this is also what we call the principles to practices gap, and we see that organizations are struggling with that. The main question is, of course, are guardrails enough? I think from my perspective, I would say no, but it's a good starting point to have. So if you have certain guidelines in place, you can still look back and see, oh, maybe our guidelines are not specific enough, or maybe we should adjust these guidelines in order to enforce them in a better way. So news outlets adopt experimentation also to, well, come up with better guidelines that can be reinforced. I mean, there's also this other question, right, of should these guidelines be reinforceable? I remember from that anecdote that I just shared that people from that news organization, more the higher level of that news organization, said, well, maybe we should come up with some sort of fine system when journalists are not transparent about it, and then an article is being published, and yeah, there were a lot of factual errors in there. Maybe we should give that journalist a fine, or maybe we should use detection software and these kind of things. I'm not sure if that's the right path to go, because that also maybe might fuel distrust within your organization. I think it's a matter also of, well, inducing trust in that regard, and creating an environment where journalists would be transparent when they would use it as well. So, of course, sandboxing, we see that in some news organizations, people are experimenting not only with ChatGPT, because I have the feeling that that's the most prominent LLM, but that there are also other large language models that are being experimented with. And that also helps to see, well, the limitations of the different LLMs. And that helps also to maybe say, well, we won't be using ChatGPT, but maybe we will use Bing Chat or another LLM in that regard. So it helps that experimentation, or also what was being mentioned in the session before, by playing around with these different LLMs. And then based on that experimentation, adjust the guidelines. So some organizations have really specific projects that they're working on. For example, a project on transcription, a project on metadata. It's 1 or 2 journalists that are working on that, and then they feed back the AI task force, so to say, and say, well, maybe we should make it more explicit or add a specific example in, for example, the internal version of these guideline documents. So I think in that essence, talking about guidelines today, almost 1 year after ChatGPT was unleashed onto the world, I think there is still a lot changing. There is just a lot in the air as well. And these guideline documents might also change. And that is also, I think, what brings me to next steps, because we're also planning to do follow-up research on that. So 3 concluding thoughts, and I already said it, it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel here. There are already existing ethical guidelines and codes. Sometimes you even have media regulators that are thinking on guidelines. I know, for example, in Belgium, where I'm from, they have already published their guidelines. The media regulator, or the organization that is responsible for the journalist or the media landscape in Belgium, they already published that in February. So they were quite pioneering in that. And I know for a fact that news organizations took some of these guidelines from the broader, media regulator, and then adopted that to their own values. So that's, I think, the first concluding thought. The second one is adopt a risk assessment approach. I've seen that in some news organizations, that they think about, well, maybe if it is a headline, then the risk is not that big, because still an editor or a journalist is choosing these headlines. Whereas if you would use it to summarize specific texts or stuff like that, that might be a bigger risk, because there might be factual errors coming into that. Maybe journalists copy paste text in ChatGPT, and then there's also this privacy issue. So having some sort of different levels of risk. And if we think about regulation right now that is being drafted, the AI Act at the European level is also quite risk assessment approach based. So it's also looking at different, now I'm talking more broader than just generative AI. Of course, generative AI will be part of that legislation as well, but just AI in general as well. So I think a risk assessment approach, but I also, and we've also seen that some news organizations are not always, inclined to do that, or used to having this kind of approach in there. So sometimes it's also looking at what values does your organization have and what potential risks come with that. So some organizations then organize workshops and these kind of things, also to distill these different risks that are behind the different uses of generative AI tools. And then the third one is, well, if you have the resources, establish a diverse group to draft guidelines. I've seen some news organizations that only, had people from the newsroom in these task forces, so to say, and these AI task forces. And those were people that, were maybe covering AI or were very interested in AI. But I think sometimes you need a more diverse group, people from legal or more policy, maybe also someone from the more executive level in there, to have guidelines that are also, that can be implemented more broadly throughout your organization. So next steps, and I think this is also one of the main takeaways I hope that you get from this presentation, is that this is still very much a work in progress. We did the first analysis of these 21 guidelines, but of course now we're planning of doing follow-up research. We're looking into, external, internal guidelines, and maybe doing an analysis of that, looking at the differences, how it is being translated. And that also brings me to the second point, which is, the principles to practices gap. So more practice-oriented workshops on guidelines. We're organizing that in the new year in the Netherlands, but also in other countries. And then the last one that I wanted to mention is we're also running a survey that's the University of Amsterdam, that's Northwestern University and Associated Press on generative AI. And this is almost my last slide. I just included this survey. So if you're interested in filling in the survey on, well, generative AI, I think you can scan just a QR code. We will have the survey open, I think, until the end of this year. And we would be very grateful because, of course, that will again inform and enhance our understanding of these guideline documents in the news industry. And with that, I want to conclude. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannes. That was quite insightful. I don't want to waste time, so I'm going to get into the Q&A, and hopefully we can get through as many as possible in the next 5. I'll push it for 10 minutes. First question, to avoid being dismissed as PR, what issues should the guidelines address?
You mean PR in the sense that they just have these guidelines in place?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what I said in the initial analysis, just look at the values of the organization that you're working in and look at that and take that and try to translate that into, well, really specific use cases. So for example, if you have human oversight or these kind of things, try to come up with very specific uses of generative AI tools and then think of, well, how should we implement that in our own organization? So I think the PR in the sense is that sometimes I see guideline documents that are just super vague. And I think the key there is to make it as, well, concrete as possible. And that's maybe the case then for the internal guidelines rather than for the external guidelines, but just also that your journalists or the people that work in the news organization really have a true feeling of, okay, I can use it for this kind of use, but not for that kind of use.
Cool. A question from Claire Spencer at the BBC. What are your observations as to why the message that the guidelines don't always get through to the workforce?
Well, I think it's good to have workshops in place and these kind of things, but I have the feeling also that these workshops are sometimes a one-off. So there is like this one-off workshop talking about guidelines or maybe talking about experimentation on generative AI tools. And I think it's more this kind of long-term approach of taking people through what generative AI tools can do, but also what it cannot do. And I think in terms of that, it just needs to be something, a practice that you keep on doing. So it's not by hosting one workshop that people will know that there are guidelines. And then, like I said, some of these guideline documents even change, for example, with Wired. So I think it's just a real challenge to, if you send it out just by email, you cannot, well, you cannot think that everyone will then be informed about that. So I think having some discussions, some workshops, like I said, can really help to get a better understanding of these guidelines.
Closely related to that, from Ika Chris Mantari from The Conversation Indonesia, how do you create a guideline when your newsroom is divided into two completely opposite camps, the conservative and the liberal?
Yeah, I think the key there is also to sit down with these different people and sitting down in one room and talking about, okay, maybe if there is a very conservative and a very liberal group, maybe the key is to think of some experimentation that you would run for, I don't know, 1 or 2 weeks, and that you as a group then discuss, well, maybe we won't be using these generative AI tools. I think that's also fine. It's also fine to state in your guidelines to say, well, we won't be using it because it's too risky. It has too many limitations, these kind of things. But that is a more valuable outcome than not sitting together and just, well, waiting before something happens like I illustrated in the third part of the workshop, that people start making mistakes or people are under a lot of time pressure, so that there is some sort of statement out there. And again, I think it's really necessary to keep on talking about these guidelines, because yeah, it's not because you have these guidelines that they are translated throughout the organization. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you two more questions because we've reached sort of the end of our session, or
Yes.
four. Let's see if we can get through all of them. Two closely related questions, one from somebody else and then one from George Polotrak from DFV. So on the enforcement and the example you gave, should the non-declared use by staff for publication be potentially equivalent to a plagiarism offense?
Yeah, well, that's also something that was being talked about at that one news organization. I think it's tricky. I think the use of, well, these tools is also a very like lazy, well, the journalist that used that tool and then just published that article was just very lazy about that. So I'm not entirely sure if it's the same as plagiarism, but it is still, well, news organizations are thinking about just having some sort of fines in place or some control mechanisms, because otherwise people just keep on using these tools without, yeah, without feeling the consequences or without taking the consequences for that. But that's a good one. I wouldn't say it's the same. But of course it is still, yeah, it can get a lot of repercussions, because of course, when you think about the one anecdote that I gave, I'm really curious what would have happened if that news organization said, well, it was because of ChatGPT. Then maybe it would have been even in, I don't know, other newspapers and these kind of things. So yeah, it's interesting what happens when the guidelines are not being followed. You're muted.
My bad. You mentioned that some of these guidelines change very quickly. Can you elaborate more on why these guidelines change? What goes into the thinking process of news organizations when they change these guidelines? And then second to that, what are the obstacles for newsrooms in putting guidelines into practice? Is it knowledge or skills gap or both or something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to the first question, I remember specifically one news organization that also changed their guidelines because they said, well, GPT-4 is now out there and GPT-4 has other capacities. So it's mostly linked also to, well, how the technology is evolving or how it is updated, because GPT-4 can do data analysis and these kind of things. And these are maybe very specific processes that are happening within a news organization that wasn't, well, it wasn't possible before GPT-4 to do that with ChatGPT. So in that regard, these guidelines were being updated because there were new features in there. But sometimes it's also, like I said, because there is experimentation and they find, well, this is not like a good description of our guidelines. So they just rewrite their guidelines to make it more specific in general. And then to the second question, is it a knowledge problem? I mean, I think it is a knowledge problem. I think also now it went so quickly that people came up with these guideline documents that I think there isn't always expertise in a news organization, specifically in smaller news organizations. So I think in that regard, we can learn already from guideline documents that are around. And I think we can also learn from, well, regulation that is out there. For example, in the UK, there is Ofcom and they have specific, well, regulation on disclosure, these kind of things. So I think by looking at media regulators and by looking at these documents, I think you can learn a lot already and find some of the elements that you can put in your own guideline document. So it can even be done by one person if you're a really small organization.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannes, for your time and sharing your insights on putting together guidelines. I apologize that I was not able to get through all the questions, but I'm sure if you drop Hannes an email, he will surely respond, or even a tweet, he will certainly respond. Again, thank you, Hannes.